So thank you very much for being part of CISO panel. So the panel title is CISO Panel Modern Security Challenges. So as Thomas Matthews introduced, Robert Martin, Michael Alguire, Gordie, and Hani Mansi, I would like to give opportunity to introduce yourself in detail. Let's start with Robert.
Thanks, Hani. Appreciate that. Robert Martin, I'm the CISO at Alberta Health Services. I've been at AHS for pushing 11 years now, came out of the consulting world before that. So I was saying that I know probably a third of the people in this room from the fact that we've worked together in various contexts before that. And so I've been in security since 1996. And if you have a good few minutes after this, I'll give you my first story around security consulting and internet consulting from 1996, but I won't bore everybody with the details for now.
And my name is Mike Alguire, and I'm with the government of Alberta, and I've been with the government for 2 years. Before that, I was with ATCO and Enbridge previously in various security roles. You can check my LinkedIn profile if you're really interested, but probably not.
Gordie's not a tech guy.
Testing. Gordie Ma, University of Alberta. I've had the absolute privilege and honor of working with everyone here, and either directly or indirectly. And we do value the ability to network and share with our cohort. And I see that it's great that people are also doing this even as we speak, and don't underestimate the power and the value, and keep networking.
I'm Hani Mansi. I'm with the city of Edmonton, and I've only been there for a couple of months, but I've been in the industry for 28 or so years, way back when, you remember those round tapes you would see on movies, way back when those actually existed on mainframes. It's a real privilege to be here, and I actually recognize a lot of the faces in the room, so it kind of really reminds me of how small a community this is, and thanks to the few people that really put in a lot of effort making first BSides in Edmonton a reality.
Yeah,
I should add that Hani was the proctor for my CISSP exam 15 years ago. So. That's how old he is.
So I would like to give a disclaimer as a UFA employee, and these questions are coming from me as a security professional, not as a UFA employee. So
It's all off the record, right?
Yeah.
So my first question is, how are your organizations staying on the top of current risk when every week something new is discovered that demands your attention?
Thanks, Billy. Billy's laughing. So I think the real answer from my perspective is that you can't be concerned about the latest name of ransomware attack or the latest IoT vulnerability. I think what you do is put in place practices and processes so that you're able to deal with whatever comes your way, and then also recognize that you're never going to be secure 100%. You can do everything you can to react as well as possible, but I think that incident response and that ability to figure out how to stop an incident from happening is as important as the work in making sure that you have the controls in place at the start.
Yeah. Michael, your thoughts?
Oh, I'd love to just echo what was just said. From my perspective, it's really about having the right procedures in place before something happens. Most of what you hear in the news can be taken care of with having a good process, a good set of people doing good work in the background. By the time you hear it in the news, I generally have a second problem. It's not how to deal with it, because I know we have good people in place and it's probably dealt with. The larger problem for me becomes responding to all of the questions from within the organization, because when people hear about these things in the news, the first thing they do is they'll call the CISO and say, I hope this isn't happening here, right? Tell me everything's okay. And so when you have good people and good process behind the scenes, you can tell them that.
Yeah. Gordie?
Similarly, and again, as has been echoed, because it's not practical to be able to to keep abreast of all the latest and greatest. So it's absolutely crucial that you do have a solid security posture. And it's interesting. I was involved in a presentation recently where some of the theme was same as it ever was. The song from the Talking Heads, David Byrne, and that is to say, some of the very similar exploits and exposures from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, we're still dealing with those today. And so that, again, likens to what the two colleagues mentioned about ensuring then that you have that adequate posture, and that now it's no longer a matter of if, it's definitely when, and so you absolutely need to have that recoverability. And similarly, we have to try to deploy more of a holistic viewpoint. So where previously it was very myopic, like one simple example is that your network team, for example, may see some traffic analysis and whatnot from a certain IP or a specific range of IPs. And so they'll see that in of itself. And then your identity and access management people may see a huge number of unsuccessful login attempts. And again, that previously would be in that silo. And then your database people may see some excessive amounts of exfiltration, or be it file sizes or file types or be it sessions or not. And then so where it's crucial now for effective response is to have that holistic approach, whereas when you can piece that entire picture together, it can give you the ability to in a more timely fashion actually address. And sorry, with respect to again, trying to address the impracticality of everything that's new and latest and greatest, don't feel too proud to acknowledge that it's difficult and self-there. And again, leverage from whatever sources. We at the university fully leverage from colleagues from other universities, leverage from whatever sources within, and from professional sources as well.
Yep. Hani?
I would say the same as what's already been said. I would say that it's a matter of looking at things from a risk-based approach, and not all risks demand the same level of response.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that when we look at things, we look at what are our material assets, and so I react accordingly. If I have something that's less material, I take probably a different approach as if I have something that's very, very material to the organization. The other thing is, I think it's in preparedness, and so that preparedness requires that you're not reacting, but you're thinking, planning well in advance. You're identifying what your key controls are, and really getting those key controls in place, and really stabilizing them. As what's already been said, it's not just a technology. It's you want to make sure that you have your people, you have your process, and yes, there's this thing called technology, but you get it all fully implemented, fully operationally implemented, and then you have measures to know that things are the way that they need to be. And then that preparedness also means that you have a way of responding as those incidents happen.
Okay, thank you. So we heard like lots of GDPR in lately, in the news. So how have new regulations with a global impact like GDPR impacted your organization? Let's start with you.
Sure. So GDPR doesn't necessarily fall directly in my scope, but it's something that we're always kind of watching out for. Any third-party requirements, any legislative requirements are always things that you're very mindful of, and you're trying to respond to each of them. But really the way that I like to look at it is it's a risk-based approach yet again. If I do the right things, I will by default start to comply to a lot of those requirements. So we do those right things, we manage things from a risk-based approach, and then naturally compliance will start to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But one-offs are, in my mind, not a very cost-effective way to go after compliance mandates. So I don't do something for GDPR that's completely different from PCI, that's completely different from how we protect critical infrastructure, for example.
Okay. Gordie?
With respect to the university in scope of GDPR, we've assessed some of the primary criteria. So for instance, we do have physical presence in EU member states. in Italy, there's the Cortona the Bachelor of Arts program, for example. And then secondly, we don't actively target or market to EU citizens with respect to the sale of our sales of goods. And then thirdly, we do conduct some form of automated decision-making based on personal information of EU citizens. So be it customizing your web experience, or if you're applying and there's a auto evaluation based on your grades and whatnot. So there are some touch points of scope, and then so exactly as Hani mentioned, now what's the risk? What's the risk to the university and to the EU citizens and with respect to legislation? So we're getting a sense of the magnitude. So the number of EU citizens we have in our faculty, staff, or students, and again in relation to the amounts of activity with those few physical locations and whatnot. And then so based on the risk approach, that's going to inform our the tactics and our strategy to ensure that we're within compliance in an appropriate commensurate means.
Yeah. Michael?
So for us, we started looking at GDPR a number of months ago, just like everybody did. We started panicking when everybody started panicking. and we looked at it from two perspectives. So there's the regulatory perspective, and the question we had to answer there was, does this apply to us? Right? Are these rules applicable and enforceable here and to our employees? And the other side was more what I was involved in, which was, do we have the controls in place to support those regulatory requirements if they are in fact requirements? So our office went through an exercise of going through and saying, okay, well, if worst case scenario, it applies,
okay,
how does that impact us? And as the province, of course, we have a number of people, so I'll just give you one example that was brought up. If a European Union citizen visits Alberta and has a problem and ends up in the hospital, for example, or somewhere else, interfaces with the government in some way, we generate records on them. And then the question was, well, will we have the controls in place in those systems in order to fulfill the requirements of the EU? So to make a long story short as I can, we do have those controls in place. And so we're able, if it's applicable to us, we're able to respond. The question of whether it's applicable or not is still being handled by the appropriate legal authorities who are coming up with answers there for that stuff. So we kind of broke it in two, and I just handled our piece. But that's how we look at it.
Robert?
Yeah, so Gordie's second point, I think, was whether or not we're marketing services to EU citizens. And our legal counsel determined that we are not actively marketing to EU citizens, so the GDPR didn't apply. Somebody comes to Alberta to go skiing or hiking or breaks their leg and goes into a hospital, we're certainly going to give them the services, but we didn't think that there was any particularly additional controls that we needed to apply because of GDPR. And we have lots of controls, and we determined that GDPR wasn't applicable to us.
Thank you. So as a security professional, I think security awareness is really important. So what do you think the effective components of our information security awareness program should be? So, Robert?
So I think I'd open by saying that the biggest threat to any organization is really the number of people in the organization. And that doesn't mean that people are bad or malicious or stupid. It just means that people do things and you have to give them permissions to do work, and if those things go bad, things are compromised. You look at almost any of the large publicized breaches in the last probably 3 or 4 years, they all started with some sort of compromise of the individual.
Yeah.
And so from a security awareness perspective, I think there's really two ways to look at it. One is to do as much as you can to educate and inform, try to find ways of getting those individuals to understand that this is important to them in their professional life, but also in their personal life. So for years, we've tried to put things in place that help them at home or help them with their kids or help them with their parents so that they understand this is applicable to them, not just in a professional context. But then the second point is that understanding that there's going to be problems and you're going to have to respond later on.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Michael?
Yeah, and we've come to much the same conclusion about focusing on people as they're the most likely vector right now for problems in our environment. But, and kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but we've also come to the conclusion that simply focusing on security for individuals at work doing their jobs is not something that people tend to consume voraciously and actively. And so in order to entice them to get the message, we package it with what they can do at home, what they can do for their children, so that basically there's a reason to bring them out or to have them start reading and consuming the stuff instead of just another one of the required trainings, right?
I heard that GOA try phishing employees and then educate them.
We do have we have run in the past some phishing campaigns. I think most mature organizations do something.
Okay.
But we've tried very hard to not make it a punitive exercise.
Okay.
And I think that's important because people don't need another slap in the back of the head for doing something wrong.
Oh yeah,
okay?
100%.
We made a strong point to not turn this into if you get caught, big red light and an email goes to your boss saying you need to go for remedial training, right? That's not approach that works well for us.
Gordie?
Just to add like a different angle from the university, and because Robert and Michael are bang on, we're actually trying to assess how to make our existing training more effective. And that is to say, since we've deployed quote unquote mandatory training, we have the recourse now when we're doing breach management to see if said employee did indeed fulfill and comply with their training requirements, and in pretty much all the cases that they have. So what is that saying? What is the training actually buying us? So we're trying to develop other types of measures and trying to determine how we need to augment our existing training.
Okay.
And also to the point that Michael makes, we want to focus on the learning opportunities. So for example, if you're failing the email phishing testing, then there'd be some learning opportunity there. But we also want to leverage from all angles of learning opportunities. So even if you're successful in that email phishing testing, there's still an opportunity to further communicate and also let them know, great, this is a test, you've passed, but here's some other things to know, that type of thing.
Yep, thank you. Hani?
I would agree with what's been said. So we talked about key controls, or I talked about key controls a little bit earlier, and for us, awareness is such a control. It's very much a key control. And if you look at how employees work today with devices that are mobile, with access anywhere, and even when we look at some of the assets and the fact that they're no longer on premise, some of those assets are now elsewhere, it becomes very, very important to educate people as to what to do, what not to do, signs for when things seem that they're off. And a big part of that is awareness. And we take it from multiple approaches. There's awareness that we would do for an end user as they're being onboarded. There is awareness that we would do for people with administrative access because of the level of privilege that they have and the potential of what they could do to assist them, as well as training that we would do for executives because of the kind of access that they have and the authority that they have to be able to make decisions that could impact potentially systems. But I would say, going back to some of what I've heard, what I prefer the most is when we educate our employees of how to protect themselves at home and how to protect their families, because it really makes it real.
Adding to same question, like the city of Edmonton is doing something different for the people, like general public, for security awareness, cybersecurity awareness?
Well, so in the 2 months that I've been there, we're in the process of planning. That hasn't quite started yet.
Okay.
It takes a little bit of time to get
Yeah.
some of those things in place, but what I'm very much used to and what we're going to be looking to do is around awareness, around doing it through things like phishing campaigns, around advertisements, and so on. And a big part of it as well is looking at it from a positive point of view, making sure that we don't use it in a punitive way, as what Mike has said, because the last thing you want to do is you did something wrong. It's, you know, we're trending and we're trending in the right direction, and here are some of the benefits of doing that. But it's always looking at it from what's good. Because the last thing we want to do is disable functionality or have, you know, systems be less used. We want people to access the systems, to be able to use that information. We just want to help them in knowing good practices from potentially risky practices.
Yeah, we have some of our awareness materials that we make publicly available through our external website and YouTube channels and all that, because there are messages that we want to keep internal, but there are things that are useful, and there's a lot of people that go to the AHS website, and if we can catch a few of them, we can do that. It's the same thing with the city. The city's obviously a big part of, you know, people's lives in this community, and so things that we can do that are just beyond our organization is important to consider as well.
Thank you. So we heard Internet of Things these days on TV, like cybersecurity conferences everywhere. So what has been the most surprising issue related to the Internet of Things encountered inside your organization? So, Robert?
I'm going first. Wait, we don't have an Internet of Things problem. What are you guys talking about? I think I'm going to answer that in sort of two ways.
Okay.
The first way I'm going to answer that is it's just another threat vector. It's just another thing you have to deal with. And if you are chasing Internet of Things because that's the thing that you think you have to chase, then you probably don't have your PCI controls and your SOX controls, and you probably don't have key controls testing, and you probably don't have all these other things that are a problem. To be honest, though, or to be fair, though, I think the work that we've already done needs to be extended into that space. And that's where the trick is going to come in. It's not so much that we have no issues with regards to those devices, whether they're medical devices or building management systems, or what did Tim say, the vacuum cleaner with the camera on top. I'm not sure why you would have a camera on your vacuum cleaner, but anyways, it's not so much those specific devices, it's the fact that you have to understand that those now are assets on your network, and your CMDB probably needs to reflect that now. And so that's the first way that I take a look at it. It's the things that you do as part of your hygiene program, as part of your operational excellence program. Those are the things that you have to do across your environment, irregardless of the type of device. Specifically, I think the thing from my, maybe not AHS specifically, but there's been lots of issues reported in the medical device community about issues and vulnerabilities being exposed on some of the medical devices in the industry. And I think the thing that's been most interesting about that is NIST in the United States has come out with their standard on how to secure wireless infusion pumps. So infusion pump is the thing that pumps the drugs into your veins. That is indicative of the fact that it's obviously a pervasive problem and needs a solution. And so without giving details of what's in our environment, I think that's the most impressive thing is that it's got that much visibility that people have come up with the standard on it.
Okay, thank you. Michael?
So from my perspective, the surprising thing for us and our team has been a lack of awareness amongst the business folk that these devices are technically IT devices and that they exist. So our networking teams generally don't manage these devices, and a lot of them have been within government for a long time. And so you have business people who know that there's these controllers in place doing various things in the government, but they're in the back of their mind, it's not an IT device to them, not the same way that their laptop is. And so a number of years ago, we did an initial scan of our environment to say, okay, well, what do we have in this space? What are our risks here? And we came up with a very large number of devices. And when we would go to speak to the business folk who owned those devices, they were oblivious. They had no idea that these things were actually on the internet, right? In their words. So your question about what's the most surprising thing,
Yeah.
it's been a lack of awareness amongst non-technical people about how much connectivity there actually is. And yes, your smart TV is
Oh,
an
yeah.
internet device, but
Yeah.
a lot of folks don't know that.
Yeah.
Right? They're not aware of that. So it's been a lot of raising awareness amongst them.
Big Brother is watching us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gordie?
Similar to Michael's last point, what's surprising is the degree and magnitude to which we're already in it.
Yeah.
And so we'll find out through our close interaction with our facilities folks, be it parking meters, the vending machines, SCADA systems, the building management systems and whatnot. And then as Robert alluded to, hopefully and fortunately, in some cases, that there's already coverage through existing managed device controls and whatnot. And where there's not, then there's new flags raised for us. And similarly, in the health sciences council and with a lot of the biomedical IP enabled devices, it's surprising how much we're already into it, and it goes on and on with our other disciplines and faculties.
Yeah.
And so again, on the one hand, hopefully what's in place already for device management and how you account for risk from unmanaged devices and so on and so forth, can provide adequate coverage. But then there's still a lot of work to do because it's only growing in even more magnitude.
Yeah.
The controls might not apply, but the processes that you would want to already exist, and it's that extension that's important. If the coverage isn't there, we know what to do.
I would agree totally. So I mean, we get into similar challenges where some people will say, well, do I have this? Is this real? Is this a real concern? And I think to some people, it's not. They don't think it's here yet. But the reality is, we are, with IoT or industrial IoT today, where Wi-Fi was 20, 25 years ago, people didn't know if it was just a fad, if it was going to become a reality, and it's a part of how we live every day. This is here, and it's in volume, and it's going to continue to increase. So one is we need to get the right executives aware of that reality and what it means. And in some cases, you look at these assets and you go, well, are they generating information, and how valuable is that information? And there may be cases where it is, but in some cases, it's the function that those devices perform, whether it's in industrial control systems or in health and safety and so on. So the reality is, it's a new kind of asset, but it's not that different. And the approach that we take in treating that asset is not new. We already know what to do, how to deal with it, where our key controls are, how to protect ourselves. And we need to look at these systems based on the materiality, apply our key controls, understand our risk, and we're never going to get to zero risk and make informed risk decisions. But as these systems become more and more a reality, or they're going to become more and more a risk.
So here are people who are from different organizations, so they might be want to know about managed services security provider. So some of organizations, including I think Government of Alberta, utilize services of managed service security provider, while others are considering it here. Are there any highlights, comments, or horror stories? No offense. You can share related to MSSPs.
Let me grab my popcorn.
Yeah.
I want to hear this one too.
There will be no horror stories. I value my job. If there's something I could say that to be mindful of or to think about before you go to a managed service provider, something that we've been trying to come to grips with after the fact. When you go to a service provider and you set up your contracts, there'll be expected deliverables, of course. What you expect from them when you expect it, and often, like what we've done, it's essentially a black box service, right? You're paying for a service from them, so that's well and good from our perspective when I'm thinking about, well, do I have to have staff, and I don't have to manage those staff, I don't have to manage the budget for the software, I don't have to do the patching, right? All of that goes off the table, but what often gets forgotten is that if you do that and your organization is planning on maturing in the future and and looking into, like, for example, I have a team that does threat intelligence.
Yeah.
And so in order to do good threat intelligence, you need a lot of data from all of your devices. If you've outsourced to a managed service provider as a black box service, a lot of that data is being aggregated outside of your environment, and you're just getting, you know, views of it, summaries of it. And in order to do good threat intelligence, you need to be able to mine a lot of that data. And so the trouble people can get into is if your service provider is also servicing other clients, they'll have one common set of tools, for example, that they use, and they'll be very reluctant to give you access through those tools into their environment. So the one thing, the takeaway for next time or somebody considering it that I would say is, aside from the services and all that, think about your future considerations, where you want to go, and if you're going to lose a lot of that big data to mine yourself, you might want to include that in the contract somehow, or factor in, you know, getting it back from the vendor after it's been aggregated. I mean, it's true that it all comes from you in the first place. That's true. But after you've pushed it all out, it's a lot easier to go grab it from one source than to go back in your own environment and find it again in 8 or 10 or 3,000 different places.
That's right. Gordie?
Absolutely. That aspect about integration is huge, and we're taking a serious look. So whether it's from a managed security service provider or just a managed service provider, generally speaking, or a SaaS service or what have you. As you said, there's data out there in disparate silos now, and so our interfacing needs, our integration needs, we're not wanting to be 5 years more down the road and realize that it's no longer practical to have some means of integration and interface. So we're looking at some solutions now. With respect to managed service providers, generally speaking, we've always held that three sort of general principles. You as the customer own the data. Two, you, the customer, and the service provider share the responsibility for securing the data. And number three is you, the customer, bear the responsibility for assuring that the service provider has adequate privacy and security of the data. And so it's a traditional adage how you can't outsource your responsibility, but just with the proliferation of SaaS services and whatnot, like that's never been more true.
Yeah, thank you. Hani?
So I would add that managed services or managed security services are just another way in which to operate your assets. And you have to really understand the pros and the cons of the different options they have available to you and go with what makes sense. But you should do this with anything, but especially when you start moving some of those functions out, really understand what your requirements are and make sure that you document those and ensure that those are injected in the contract, and ensure that you truly understand that contractual agreement, its terms, its conditions, your responsibilities, that of your providers, and ensure how you would repatriate that asset should you ever choose to. That's sometimes not something that's often thought about, but finally, back to Gordie's point, understand that you are asking someone to do something, you're assigning them that responsibility, but that accountability still sits with the organization. It's still your asset and it's still your risk. No matter what, it's still going to come back to you. So really, really understand your responsibilities and theirs.
Robert, for this?
So in the last several years, we've insourced pretty much everything, and the main reason that we've done that is, the main two reasons I would say is, one, the contracts that we had in our outsource arrangements were old and not reflective of the modern IT environment. So, we wanted to get rid of those contracts so that we could do that. Second of all, we spent a considerable amount of time, probably a decade now as AHS, to consolidate and standardize our infrastructure and our processes, whether it's IT or buildings or whatever across the province. And it's probably impossible, it's certainly not practical to start outsourcing when your processes internally aren't consistent, or you have different architecture and different applications across various zones. So we don't have a lot of experience looking at outsourcing, because we haven't done it because of
Yeah.
where we were of the consolidation and integration.
Thank you. So, Hani, checkbox compliance is slowly being replaced by risk-based decision-making. So, how have your organization risk management programs adapted to this current trend?
So I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but it's really compliance is sort of what happens if you do risk management
Yeah.
the right way. And if you're just chasing compliance, you're going to spend a lot of effort, and you may hit some of your compliance requirements, potentially not all, or at least not in a very effective way. So yes, it's looking at your risks, how to manage your risks, potentially identifying and focusing on those key controls, doing those things well. And it's not just the technology, it's the technology, the process, and the people, and continual measurements. And then what you'll do is you'll want to identify how these controls that you have help you meet the different compliance requirements. And if you do that, there'll be very few things that are left over that you may need to do specifically for one compliance
Yeah.
requirement versus another, but it becomes more the exception than the rule. That was my perspective.
Gordie?
Hani, do you recall about 15 years ago, you said to me that the checklist compliance, it's a lot of noise. It's a lot of white noise. Do you recall that?
I do.
Yeah, you were ahead of your time, as always. And the timing was interesting because at the university, there's a few mechanisms. We have an enterprise risk management committee, which it's a cross-section of the key portfolios across the university. And so in IT and for information security, we're looking to augment the traditional sort of checkbox, the traditional more flat y-axes and x-axes of likelihood and consequence. And we need to superimpose onto their asset value. We need to superimpose onto their other data points, other criteria that will empower senior leaders to make the risk-based decisions. And where, be it financial risk, be it reputational risk and whatnot. And then that's how we need to frame. So it's similar to what Tim was speaking to first thing in the morning as well, needing to frame some of the questions in a meaningful manner. And because IT and security shouldn't be making decisions in these fiscally troubling times where some difficult decisions need to be made. So the timing is interesting with this question. We're evolving to become much more risk-based in our security management.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so from an organizational standpoint, I found that the transition between going from checkboxes to managing risk is very, I don't want to say it's easy or simple, but from our perspective, it's well understood and very easy and in a way simple. But the larger challenge with it is the organizational challenge, which is getting the organization to accept the idea that risk, instead of existing with the tech nerds in CISO, it belongs to them. And so we're trying to evolve in our environment with the business partners that we have, a relationship whereby they see themselves as owners of the technology, owners of the data, and we're advisors.
Yeah.
And getting to that stage for some organizations can be very difficult, because there can be a history in some places of nobody wants to take on responsibility, especially when it comes, and I can feel for them, especially when it comes to technology. If you're not a technology person, and somebody like me shows up at your door and says, we're changing things and now you're responsible for server this and this application and all this stuff, and
Close
I need you to
the
make
door.
these decisions, right? Like, can we apply this patch? It's your decision, but it's going to cost this. These were decisions they didn't have to make before. So there's considerable resistance, and we're working through that, and it's the right thing to do, but I guess my only comment about this is that we can't expect it to happen overnight in an organization simply because of that. Any kind of change like that takes time, and people have to start accepting their responsibilities instead of us just dumping it on them, because that never works.
Robert?
There's probably 15 or 20 different points I can make, because this is a really interesting question to me. So I'll kind of tackle a couple points. So one is my counterpart on privacy, Linda French, doing the same sort of thing with regards to, well, actually, Michael, this is your responsibility.
Right.
And they would go, well, no, it's not. It's like, well, actually, it's always been your accountability, your responsibility. We just weren't very good at communicating that before, and you weren't really good at understanding that before. And I think it's a funny thing to think about. But I think people, the leaders have matured, and our programs have matured, and we've matured as leaders to get to the point where we can have those conversations. We probably couldn't have had that even 10 years ago, just because we weren't in that position, and IT wasn't in that position, or risk wasn't in that position. The other thing that I would say, just from a purely titling point of view, we went through a reorg 5 years ago inside of IT at AHS, and I changed our team name from IT Security and Compliance to Information Risk Management. Wow. And that was strategic in that I wanted to get the focus on risk, but it was actually amazingly transformative because the conversations changed. When you have compliance in your title, people go, oh my God, right? When you have, and literally the toner wasn't dry on the draft org chart. Yeah. When one of our counterparts in IT on the ops side picked up the phone and called me and said, well, you guys are the risk people. How can you help me solve this problem? And it just sort of changed the flavor of the conversation because we can help manage risk instead of being about compliance. Mm-hmm. The last thing I would say is one of the things that I've learned over the last several years, whether it's COBIT or ITIL or PMBOK or anything, the pedantic application of theory is never a good thing. And even today, we're continuing to mature how we look at the COBITs and the ITILs and the ISF, IRAM stuff to figure out what's going to make sense from our perspective. Mm-hmm. How are we going to build in our organization the controls, the tools, the frameworks, the reporting, so that we have something that works for AHS. And if I were in Hani's shoes, I would do a different thing because those frameworks wouldn't necessarily, that same combination of frameworks wouldn't necessarily work at the city. And I think that's the important thing. What's going to work for your organization?
Thank you.
I would just, if I would just add to what Robert said in the sense that for this to continue to evolve, we need to continue to speak less technical and more business. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's really the only way to move forward in a successful way. And yes, where the accountability ultimately rests is always a bit of a balance and sometimes a negotiation. Sometimes
maybe sometime one-sided negotiation.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, if we take it and we speak it in business risk, mm-hmm. it starts to become an easier conversation to have, and where it lands becomes a little more obvious.
Yeah. If I could just add one back to you, I think over time I've seen in my career a lot of times that IT would say, well, the business doesn't want to do that, or the business will never accept that, or the business, and it's like, well, let them decide what they want to take on, and I think you'd be surprised at the maturity and the level of understanding mm-hmm. if you let them make the decisions they need to make.
Oh yeah. So like we live in Alberta, so we pay for like insurance, like home insurance, car insurance. Now it's like cyber insurance. So how many people are here like looking for like, cyber insurance for their organizations? Can they raise their hands?
Yeah.
One there.
One guy in the back corner. Two. There we go.
Two. Yes.
So you needed to know what it guaranteed you before you paid for it first. That
makes sense.
I get car insurance because the law tells me I have to.
So my question comes to, what is your perception of cyber insurance? Let's start with you. Final question from me.
I'm pretty sure Gordie hasn't gone first yet.
Yeah.
Nice deflection.
Okay, let's do
Well
Gordie.
played.
Let's do Gordie.
I can't get a word in edgewise.
Oh, yeah, that's the problem, yeah.
It's an interesting question timing-wise as well. So at the university, we're coming up on 2 years in with our first ever cyber insurance policy. And prior to that, the antecedent influences. So for about 5 years prior to that point, where we finally signed on dotted line, or probably even longer, it had been no. Every year we'd be queried and it would be no. So previously, because it is such a evolving and new sector of insurance, there are some issues. Everything from an extremely high deductible. Most deductibles would be $250,000 and whatnot, and then the premiums themselves would be in the range of about $500,000 a year, and then so just again with this such a new entity and trying to negotiate a low premium but as wide a coverage as possible and as high of a limit as possible. Things just weren't working out. There's also previously a lot less clarity around if the coverage includes class action lawsuits, for example, or punitive or other penalties from legislatively or regulatory basis. And there's unclarity if paying ransomware, for example, if the coverage would account for that. And other sort of showstoppers at the time were that previously, if something hits the fan and you call it in, that the practice was that the insurer would parachute in their people.
Okay.
They have a list of their standing incident responders, and you were to stand down and step aside. And so, as you can imagine, that was a complete showstopper. Like the time it would take for a brand new set of eyes to get even somewhat familiar with the environment, like it wouldn't make sense, and just stepping on each other's toes and so on and so forth. So that was an absolute showstopper. Fast forward to now. Some of those issues and changes, they've been remedied. So for example, now specifically around the incident response management, it's a la carte. So if you call it in, they'll offer you, they can have the PR media experts. They can provide the legal experts. They can provide the digital forensics, the forensic examiner, and just so it's essentially what you need. And then there's more clarity about the scope of coverage now. So actually our thoughts are that we do see value, and we've been two years in.
Yep. Let's go back, Robert.
Back to me now, right?
Yeah.
I see how this works. Yeah. So the question was posed to me several times over a number of years as to whether or not we should get cyber insurance, and my answer was always no. And I always said, well, if we're gonna spend that much money on cyber insurance, give me that money and I'll put it into controls. So a couple things changed. One, it started coming out of the finance budget, so that was easier. Two, I think, like Gordie said, that whole model matured, and we got to the point where the value add coming from the underwriter and the broker is compelling enough, the cost is low enough, and the deliverables are clear enough that it made sense. So we signed up earlier this year, actually. And I would say that my initial reaction was very negative, because I said I wanted to spend the money on the controls. But in the times that we've had to just have even conversations with them, that value add is good. And because we do a lot of the things, we do the forensics, and we have these incident response teams, and we have a very good communications group, etc. There's a bunch of things that we didn't need, but we really said, well, what about this, the breach coach, and what about the coverage of covering the costs for Equifax or TransUnion, that kind of thing. And we got the cost down to where it actually is valuable for the organization, and the value add to me as the leader from the CISO shop is actually good, for sure.
Thank you. Michael?
So we've taken an approach with it. It's funny, I had almost an identical reaction as Robert did when the discussion of insurance came up, and we were talking dollars, and they were large amounts of money. And I was a little surprised and dismayed, not at the amount of money, but at the fact that management was prepared to consider that. But I've been asking for other things to, build better controls in our environment, which have never been on the table. But all of a sudden, insurance was in the news, and it's a new thing, and everyone wants to talk about it. And okay, well, now there's money for it. So I was a little put off at the beginning, and had a very similar reaction. But what was difficult for us to wrap our hands and heads around was the fact that it's a very new industry. I mean, even the insurance folks aren't sure how to price yet because there's not a lot of precedent and history. So we were doing a lot of back and forth with them, and it turns out that, in fact, when we would ask them a lot of very pointed questions about, well, how much would this cost if we got just this a la carte kind of service, and can we break this stuff out? They didn't have any answers to any of that. And in fact, unfortunately, within the insurance provider, there was very little technical knowledge as well. I mean, these are underwriters by nature; they're not technology people. So
That's correct.
when you're asking them, well, if I have this managed SIM service or something in place, and we have this, and here's our controls and our control set and whatnot, what kind of rate does that get us versus not having it? They can't have that conversation. They don't know.
Yeah.
So we step back from it. What we've chosen to do instead is invest in a few of the strategic services for disaster recovery and whatnot that we know we would need in the case of an emergency like that, and almost in-source them. But it opened the door to a good conversation in our organization about, okay, let's talk again about what could really go wrong. And if we don't want to pay for insurance for it, how are we going to cover off that risk? And that was sort of new money coming in. So it was a good conversation to have. But unfortunately, we did a lot of this around the mulberry bush when we were talking with the insurance companies at first, because it's a very immature space right now.
Hani?
I would, I agree in the sense that when I was asked that question a few years ago, I wasn't really a big fan. I'm now much more, I look at it much more favorably now because those sorts of policies have really matured. Pricing has kind of come down, and you do have the ability to have some a la carte, whereas in the past that was, much more restrictive. What I would say though is each organization needs to look at where it is to make a decision. Look at what you have, how mature you are. If there was to be a breach, whether or not you would be covered. Because if, for example, there was a breach and then they really looked under the hood and said, well, you don't have some of the basics, would they cover you or wouldn't they? And then really understand when there is an incident, what it is they would cover and what things would be your own cost. And you just need to look at it as a return on investment. And does this make sense or does it not? But I think it's become something that you should seriously consider at this point.
Okay, thank you. I think we are running out of time here. Yeah, so I have time for 1 or 2 questions max. So we are open to public here. Anyone want to ask? Okay, Harpreet.
Thank you. It was a great panel discussion. I'll give you a context before asking the question. So there was a ISACA study done in 2016 which says there is dearth of, by 2019 there is going to be dearth of cybersecurity professionals, 2 million we would need. So now this panel discussion is great because I'm sure it's inspiring so many students out here. In your role as CISOs, what are you doing with your organization, respective organizations? Do you have any programs in place to develop the internal talent to help your own organization as well as to help that long-term problem? And if no, are you planning any programs, or do you think there are any challenges in building those programs in the organizations? Thank you. And I would appreciate if all CISOs can answer it.
We have time constraints, sorry.
So I'll start because you're stealing some of the thunder, because I was going to talk to Gordie about the potential of partnering with some academia, because there is this shortage, and we want to have some of these people kind of with that knowledge coming right out of school, and so that we can kind of start leveraging some of those people more quickly. And I think it starts with many things, but I think first and foremost we need to get this in our schools. I think we need to get it in our post-secondary education, because I don't think we do enough of it. As the father of 2 girls, I'm very passionate about getting them in technology, at least having it be an option for them. And we looked at things like STEM programs, and I know I got them in one. I was very fortunate because there aren't many, but I got them in one this summer. But I know that not many of the provinces in Canada have it such that every student needs to take computing science, as an example. So you can finish high school and not have taken computing science. And I can't imagine not having that in my set of toolkits when I graduate high school.
Yeah. No, sorry? No?
Go ahead.
I was going to say that I think that it's not that we have to have more people in IT programs, even though I will say that we've had success, obviously, in the IT programs. It's the skill set and the tool set that's important. And I think we need to, as leaders, we need to be able to look beyond just a traditional program to say, well, is there an aptitude for that person that's going to fit into our organization? Instead of just saying, well, I need this person because she's got this degree or this diploma.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.